This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On June 23rd, the Defence and Security Studies program of the RCMI hosted a panel consisting of Lieutenant Colonel Steve Day, a former commander of Joint Task Force 2, and Dr. John White of the NATO Special Operations School. They discussed the thorny issue of hybrid threats, a survey of techniques and implications for the Canadian military.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Daniel Derek Eustace, and I'm the Director of the Defence and Security Studies Program at the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto. And I welcome you to tonight's speaker presentation on the subject of hybrid threats and implications for the Canadian Armed Forces. Ever since the Russians invaded Crimea several years ago, the West has become, I think, somewhat fascinated by the concept of hybrid threats and the presence of little green men sneaking across the border unidentified created a lot of consternation in NATO, because basically NATO did not know how to respond to that particular issue. And a lot of study and a lot of work has gone into what the meaning of hybrid threats is. One of my most recent master's students, his entire thesis was on the concept of hybrid threats and how, in his view, Canada was not prepared to deal with hybrid threats. It was a very well-written paper and very persuasive. Fortunately for us tonight, we have two speakers with us who are eminently qualified to talk about this subject, Dr. John White and Lieutenant Colonel Steve Day, retired. I'm going to introduce both of them at the outset. John is going to speak to us first, followed by Steve. And then at the end of their presentation, we will take questions and answers. You have at the bottom of your screen a Q&A function. So if you click on that, you're able to type in your question, and you can do that at any time. And I'll be monitoring those questions. At the same time, you also have a raise your hand function, so that at the end, if you're sitting there and you choose not to type your question into the Q&A, you can just press the raise your hand function, and we'll give you an opportunity then to ask your question verbally. So essentially, that's how we'll play the rules of the game tonight. And with that, allow me please to introduce your two speakers. So Steve Day was the commanding officer of Joint Task Force 2 and the Dwyer Hill Training Center base commander from 2009 to 2011. He was the National Counterterrorism Task Force commander for the Vancouver 2010 Olympic Games, 2010 G8 and G20 summits, as well as other national security operational deployments. Now, Steve is very busy in his post-military career. He founded and he's the president of Radical Ventures Canada. It's a premium national security services integrator, consultancy, and training provider. And I know he has some very interesting training facilities available to corporations and other folks. He's very passionate about national security and public safety and remains committed to supporting the men and women who protect our way of life. So Steve, welcome. I know you've spoken to our members previously, both live and I think online, so we're very grateful to have you back again. Now, someone who's new to the Royal Canadian Military Institute is Dr. John White. John served for 25 years in the U.S. Army, 22 of which in Special Forces, including training deployments to Latin America, Africa. He had combat deployments to the Middle East, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, other places we can't talk about, and peacekeeping tours with UNPROFOR and UNSO. He taught at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Leavenworth and the UK Joint Services Command and Staff College at Trimmingham. Unbelievably, he holds 4 master's degrees and only 1 PhD in military history in 2017. Since leaving the military as well, he's worked for the NATO Special Operations School since 2015, and in fact is one of Steve Day's colleagues in that venture. So they know each other very well, and they're very familiar with each other's background and expertise. So if I may, I'm going to turn this over now to John. Welcome virtually to the Royal Canadian Military Institute and our members. We hope to have you live in Toronto as soon as that's possible. But for the now, we're very happy that you're able to join us virtually. So John, thank you very much, and over to you.
Hey, thank you for the kind invitation, for the introduction, and for the invitation to speak. I'm deeply honored. I've got Canadian roots. My family came from the Maritimes a couple of centuries ago, and they were invited to live elsewhere by Her Majesty's government. Anyway, it's good to be back, even if it's only virtual. What I want to talk about is hybrid threats, because I teach a course for the NATO Special Operations School called the Countering Hybrid Threats course. I want to talk about what they are and how they manifest themselves. In the 2014 Wales Summit, the heads of state were very, very concerned by this term. It was presented to them at the Wales Summit, and they included it in the communique because it looked like a sort of a scary new phenomenon, and they wanted to get the alliance better prepared to deal with it. To the Ukrainians, it seemed like Putin had checkmated the Ukrainians before the Ukrainians were even aware they were playing chess. So it was a very scary phenomenon, and they did. The heads of state jumped on it. Now, the actors for this most of this comes from Russia, and obviously Russia is the alligator nearest the canoe for NATO. However, some of these have been employed by China, and there are others, Iran perhaps, and some others. And what I'm going to do is run through the techniques, and I want to use a football/soccer analogy that if you see your opponent's team working the ball down the pitch on the sidelines, further and further into your territory, you know what's coming. It's very difficult to score from the side of the pitch. You need a center kick. And so as I go through these techniques, what I would like for you to do, be aware of, is that if you see technique 1 and 7 and 14, then there's some others you can look for and focus your intelligence collection to be aware that may be coming. In Ukraine, virtually all of these have been thrown at Ukraine, but different countries experience different aspects of these techniques. So I'm going to run through them with emphasis on the ones that I will de-emphasize the ones that are not relevant for Canada, but I want to talk, but all of these have been observed for use by Russia, China to a lesser extent in the last, say, 5 years. So on that note, next slide, please. And again, please. Okay, so first off, what we saw in Ukraine was regular forces. Now, the Russian regular forces did in fact appear inside Ukraine. Probably not going to happen in Canada. If it does, we have a problem. But it's out there. The Russians have integrated regular Russian military forces into their hybrid threats. Next is special operations forces. The Russians employed these with particular effect inside Crimea and Donbass. And Spetsnaz is sort of a low end of what NATO would consider special operations forces. They're mostly snipers and recce forces. However, Russia has established a special operations command, and they do have forces that NATO would consider SOF or SOF equivalent. And they did employ those in Crimea and to a lesser extent in Donbass. But they have certainly used Spetsnaz in both. Okay, next is irregular forces. The Russians have been known to recruit locally forces for employment in a crisis. And this involves sometimes years in advance of making contact with people that are favorable and setting the stage for their use if needed in the future. And this is, I would say, normally done by GRU. That would be my guess. Potentially by FSB. And this was used with particular effect in Crimea and especially in Donbass, but it has been used elsewhere of recruiting local irregular forces for employment. And this would also include mercenaries. Mercenaries they're illegal in Russia, unless, of course, the owner of the company is also President Putin's chef, in which case the government turns a blind eye. So some of the guys from Wagner, for example, that were employed in Syria were recruited from inside Russia for employment in Syria. And other irregular forces have been recruited in Russia for employment in Donbass or other places. Next is economic levers. The Russians are quite good and had been since Soviet days of employing economic levers against their opponents, where, for example, gas or oil will be turned off at an inopportune time, normally in the winter, when it hurts the most, or the price will be increased substantially. The Russians are not at all afraid to do this. And a lot of these you'll see are not new. These levers are used by a number of countries around the world. But what is new about hybrid threats is how joined up they are. They're employed in a synthetic manner where they're all giving way together, as you will. Next is subversion. The Russians in Ukraine, but in other countries, have employed the subversion, which is bribing officials to either be incompetent or, in some cases, to change sides. In the middle of the Crimea crisis, a Ukrainian admiral prominently switched sides in the middle of the crisis and says, "I am now a Russian naval officer," which was quite a shock for the Ukrainian Navy. Next is criminal elements. The Russians are not at all averse to employing criminal elements to do things that they don't want the Russian government's hands on. And if they're caught, then they can be disavowed, and they frequently are. Inside Russia popular culture, there's a thing called a krisha, which is a roof. Every organization, every legitimate business has to have a krisha, a roof, to protect them. If your krisha is in the police, then the police will keep the criminal gangs from shaking you down. Sometimes, though, you have a krisha in the criminal elements that will keep the police away from shaking you down. So there's a sort of a symbiotic relationship between criminal elements and law enforcement elements in Russian policy. And sometimes you'll see smuggling, some other things that are kind of nasty. Some wet work are done by criminal elements. And this is, in some cases, integrated into Russian policy. I'm not saying that all criminal activity is integrated in Russian policy, but sometimes the Russian government will use criminal elements for their objectives. Next is info ops. The Russians are quite good at it. They have Dmitry Peskov, who's the press secretary for Putin, will have a meeting with Russian media outlets weekly and say, these are the stories we would like for you to cover, and this is the general take we would like for you to employ. They don't give a script, but they do not so subtly influence what Russian media says and what they cover in a way that if the PM were to go to CBC and say, I want you to cover this story, and here's the general take I want you to have, that would be the story. The fact that the PM was trying to, twist CBC's arm, that would be the story. But in Russia, that happens all the time. But they are quite effective at employing info ops. And mostly what Russia tries to do is not to convince you of the correctness of a Russian interpretation. What they're trying to do is to muddy the waters so that nothing is believable. 2 years after the shoot down of the Malaysian airliner, a Czechoslovakian journalist asked a journalist from Radio Free Europe, who actually shot down the airplane? Well, of course, everybody knows that the Russians shot down the airplane, but even this Western journalist was confused enough by the stories that Russia had put out that she claimed not to know who did it. Next is diplomacy. Again, I said these are not new, but they're switched up. They're joined together. Russia likes being taken seriously as a global leader. I think, for example, just recently, when Putin met with President Biden, that was a win for Vladimir Putin. To have a sit down and a talk with the president of the U.S. lends legitimacy to Vladimir Putin. The Russians are quite happy to host the Minsk, the quadripartite meeting on the peace plan for Ukraine. They like the prestige that comes with that. Russia was infuriated by the dismemberment of Serbia when Kosovo was allowed to secede from Serbia. The Russians did not support that policy. And when the West said, well, the people of Kosovo want their independence, the Russians said, okay, we're going to keep that precedent and we're going to use it ourselves later. And they did in Crimea. Next is law or lawfare, which is twisting understandings of international law to a way that suits Russia's interests and then trying to freeze that that supports them. This has happened in Donbass, where the Russians have gotten special status for the breakaway regions in Donetsk and Lugansk, which is in violation of Ukrainian law, but is now accepted as a de facto recognition that they're different. Next is ideology. The Russians, they used to, in the Cold War, used Marxism, Leninism as their operative philosophy. That's now gone. And so what the Russians use in its place is what's called the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, which is a sort of a conservative, the virtues of the Russian view of things, the Russian way of life, the Russian Orthodox Church, etc. This obviously doesn't sell as well, around the world as Marxism, Leninism did, but it's what they've got. Next is intelligence activities. As I said earlier, GRU, potentially FSB, were influential in recruiting groups inside the Donbass to say, when the time comes, we're going to tell you that we want you to come out and support us in whatever activities we're doing. And one of the leaders of the Donetsk People's Republic said that he had buried machine guns and cases of hand grenades in his backyard before the crisis even happened, which begs the question, how did a guy living in a backwater of Ukraine come across machine guns and hand grenades, etc., before the crisis even happened? But when he needed them, he had them. Next is corruption, of trying to get heads of state or agencies or companies around the West to sort of turn a blind eye to Russia's vices and emphasize Russia's virtues. The corruption could be either government agencies, individuals, maybe heads of state. Don't want to name names, but trying to turn them to do Russia's bidding when the time comes. Next is food. The Russians have embargoed food from other countries going into Russia, and sometimes they've embargoed things being sold from Russia outside. Interestingly, in the case of Moldova, Moldova has adopted a pro-Western policy during the Ukraine crisis. Russia didn't like that, so Russia embargoed mostly from Moldova. It was fruit and wine, and they said, we're not going to buy any more fruit and wine from you. However, the ethnic Gagauz people inside Moldova, their political party did support a Russian policy, and so the Russians would allow ethnic Gagauz Moldovans to ship food and wine to Russia. And that does two things. One is it rewards friends, and second, it gets different ethnicities in the same country to butt heads. Are saying, well, wait a minute, the Moldovans were saying, why can't I sell my stuff to Russia? You get to. How come I don't get to? So it helped generate inter-ethnic tensions. Next is the varying of intensity. The Russians, certainly in Ukraine, they will vary the intensity of their operations. Russia conscripts soldiers in October and April, and if you notice, the time to get those guys trained and in units, there was a spike in activity frequently in February or August. That's when Russian military activity tends to spike. Of course, the defender needs to defend everything all the time, but the attacker only needs to ramp up activity when he's ready to attack. Next is dispersion. The Russians, certainly inside Ukraine, but also in Nagorno-Karabakh recently, of putting combatants in with civilian populations. And then if the other side engages them with indirect fire or indiscriminate violent means, then the Russians will play up the fact that, see, our opponents are inhuman. They've attacked civilians when in fact they were attacking military forces that were hiding amongst the civilians. Next technique is terrorism. The Russians have done this a bit inside Ukraine. There were bombs placed at mass transit areas so that not to kill specific individuals, but to create a sense that the government in Kyiv was not able to protect its population. This, fortunately, has stopped since about 2015, 2016, but it was used in 2014. Next is intimidation. Inside Crimea and in Donbass and in other places where Russian forces are present, the locals are told, you will not oppose the Russian policy. If you do, life's going to get bad for you, and it has been. So people that are sitting on the fence and not sure about Russian owning Crimea or running Donbass are told to either leave or get with the program. Next is censorship. The Russians have censored media outlets. It's a brave media outlet indeed that is under the sovereignty of Russia that presents an anti-Putin line. It's very dangerous. And inside Crimea, there was a Turkish, a Turkish-speaking media outlet that was shut down, a Tatar media outlet that was shut down after the Russians annexed Crimea, because the Tatars do not like the fact that Russia owns Crimea now. Finally, the Russians have twisted transportation, though they'll shut down transportation means, where, for example, the rail network into Latvia, the Russians will shut down the rail network and say that it is done for maintenance, when in fact it's got it, because of the timing of it, you can tell it has an overt political purpose. Also, the Kerch Straits, the bridge that connects eastern Crimea to Kuban Peninsula, will be a big hunk of Ukrainian shipping goes back and forth under that bridge, because there are ports in the Sea of Azov that their only way out to the world is through the Kerch Straits. The Russians will close that down on short notice. And coincidentally, it is timed for periods when Russia is not getting along with Ukraine. If they want to let the Ukrainians know, we can make life difficult for you. Travel restrictions, when Western countries put restrictions on Russian government officials, the Russians will retaliate. So you know that they will do it to Canadian officials if Canada puts restrictions on members of the Russian government or oligarchs moving back and forth. So it's a sort of a tit for tat. Next is reflexive control. Reflexive control is kind of a Russian peculiar technique that involves, it's probably closest to the Western system of deception, where the Russians will think, what do we want our opponents to do? What story will cause our opponents to do what we want them to do? And who is the decider? And how can we present this story to the decider to get our opponents to do what we want them to do? And they're pretty good at this. An example would be in Georgia, 2008. The South Ossetians started shooting artillery at Georgians, and the Georgians responded militarily, and that gave the Russians a casus belli to really come down and hit Georgia quite hard, which they did in the 5-day war in 2008. Next is cyber. The Russians are quite good at this, obviously, and that's a continuing story where frequently it's GRU, but not always. Sometimes there are independent actors inside Russia that operate maybe not with the Russian government behest, but with their permission. But the GRU definitely does, and quite effectively, whether it's spear phishing like John Podesta in the Democrat National Headquarters or National Committee in 2016, or other things more recently. Next is the Orthodox Church. Not all Russian Orthodox churches are under the control of Moscow. However, the Metropolitan of the Russian Orthodox Church is, let's just say, he is a supporter of President Putin. He will say the things that Putin wants him to say. And sometimes that trickles down to parish priests that you will hear sort of a pro-Kremlin line from your parish priest. And I'm not familiar enough with the Russian Orthodox Church inside Canada to say how much of that's going on. I don't know. It does happen inside the US to a limited degree. Next is black info ops. The Russians have an agency called the FAN, the Federal News Agency in St. Petersburg, which plants, they manage fake personas, they plant false impressions. People online will present themselves as a little old lady from Chelsea, and they will, this little old lady from Chelsea will say, well, I think that Vladimir Putin's a great guy, and I don't know why people are picking on him. And no, I'm not a Russian living in St. Petersburg. I'm actually a little old lady in Chelsea. But you can look by the grammar mistakes and the language used that they're obviously not a native English speaker. Next is incursions. This has happened just up to and including the meeting between President Biden and President Putin, where Russian aircraft, Russian ships either get into neighboring countries' territorial waters or very close. We will see that, I think, in the Arctic, of getting very close to violating other countries' territorial airspace or waters. Next is civic clubs. Inside some of the countries that have ethnic Russian populations, you'll see clubs that are formed up for legal purposes, like rifle clubs of just shooting. They're rifle shooting enthusiasts, or paintball clubs, or mixed martial arts clubs that just happen to have significant numbers of ethnic Russians. And some of these ones will have guest speakers come from the GRU or the FSB and talk about tactics or techniques or whatever to these clubs. Finally, veterans organizations. There's an organization in Russia called the Afghansi, which has a legal, legitimate purpose that is to lobby governments for health care for Afghan war veterans. Nothing illegal about that. However, in the Donbass, we found that some of these members of the Afghansi would become politically active at opportune moments. Next is humanitarian convoys. The Russians have shipped. There is no factory to produce ammunition inside Donbass in the LPR, DPR. So all of the ammunition that's being fired by artillery has to come from somewhere, and the Russians send humanitarian convoys into the LPR and DPR periodically, and no one is allowed to inspect what's inside them. Next is targeted killings. In the spring of 2017, there were a string of Ukrainian SBU officers that were killed by car bombs. And these were not terror attacks, they were targeted. One of the officers, a colonel from the SBU that was preparing Ukraine's, their case for the International Criminal Tribunal is going to present Ukraine's case. His car blew up on the way to work one day. And also things like the Skripals, Navalny, and there's some others. Inside in Berlin, there was a Chechen dissident was killed with a pistol 2 years ago. And finally, peacekeeping operations or frozen conflicts in Moldova, in South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and most recently in the Donbass, and most recently in Nagorno-Karabakh. The Russian army has deployed as a peacekeeping force. And when I learned about peacekeeping with my Canadian colleagues, the Russians don't play by the same rules, where you don't want to send the military forces of a party to a conflict to be a peacekeeper in that conflict. But the Russians do habitually. And then periodically, those quote unquote peacekeepers will become involved in the conflict again, which is the reason why you don't want participants in the conflict to be peacekeepers. So now, inside Canada, not all of those are going to apply. Some of them might. Cyber, IO, black IO, maybe incursions. So they're not going to be as relevant. Ukraine has received all of them, and other countries around Europe have had varying degrees. The early days we were teaching this course, the Spanish were saying, "Why are you guys on about the Russians? Who cares about the Russians? They're not a big deal." And then we found out later, after the Catalonia independence movement, it turns out that Russians were supporting Spanish-speaking black IO operatives in Venezuela. They were urging the Catalonians to seek independence, and at the same time were urging the government in Madrid not to allow Catalonia to have independence. I can only surmise that is because the Russians wanted, anytime Spaniards, anything in the West where people are butting heads, then that's good for Russia. So that's the 30 techniques, and I'll hand over to Steve Day.
Thanks, John. Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be back, Dan. Thank you very much to yourself and Eric and the leadership there at the RCMI. Always great to speak to the assembled masses there. What I'd like to do is just want to caveat my comments up front. I failed to mention, Dan, that I am back in the reserves. I'm actually the director of the Commanders Action Group for the Canadian Defence Academy. So I do want to caveat my comments that these are my personal comments based on 7+ years of working at the NATO SOF schoolhouse and as well the business environment I've been in, notwithstanding my 20+ years in the Canadian military in advance of my retirement and then subsequent re-enrollment. So I just want to caveat it. These are my personal opinions, by no means the official position of the Government of Canada, the Department of National Defence, or the Canadian Army. What I want to do is just shape this from my lens and maybe help folks understand why I'm going to make the comments I'm going to make. As I mentioned, I've had 7+ years over at the NATO Special Operations Schoolhouse in Chev, Belgium. Dr. John and I have been around Eastern Europe, in particular, Scandinavian countries, the Baltics, the Balkans, running both counter-hybrid courses and counter-hybrid seminars at both the national and regional level in Europe. We started those seminars at NATO SOF headquarters because of requests from those nations specific to the threats that they saw coming out of that 2014 Wales Summit. And then by 2016, we started doing these both national and regional seminars. Interestingly enough, in Helsinki, Finland today, there is the NATO or NATO/European Hybrid Center of Excellence, which came about in 2017. So I offer this as a bit of a lens that, having been there and looked at it and listened at various national levels and regional levels, I've always tried to look at it from that Canadian perspective to say, kind of, so what? What does this mean for Canada? What does this mean for our allies and partners? And and NATO, and is there something I can be bringing back home to make sure that from a Canadian perspective, we're at least aware of this? And so what's kind of come to light in my perspective from a Canadian lens is that we are largely uninformed about the hybrid threats, as John has mentioned them, and we're not really tracking them per se as a population. This is not to say that national defense and the national security agencies are not tracking them. But I think as a Western liberal democracy, that our population is not tracking these, and therefore is not front of mind, which means the population cannot push our government leaders to take concrete action to do what we need to do. And so although John was talking a lot about Russia, he did as well mention China. And I do think from a Canadian perspective, those hybrid threats are probably greater from the Chinese government than they would be from the Russian government against Canada in particular. And that is not to say that Russia is not conducting hybrid warfare against Canada or Canadians. So I just want to offer that on the front end. I would also position my thoughts that I am not an individual who sees dragons everywhere. I do not believe the sky is ever falling. I think we live in a tremendous country. We are geostrategically very well positioned. But what I do believe is that we are somewhat naive. We are naive, and maybe we believe the fallacy of the Canadian peaceable kingdom. Or almost a century ago, former Senator Raoul Dandurand's thinking that Canada and Canadians lived in a fireproof house, far from those challenges of international relations that were consuming Europe in the 1920s in particular. Those two fallacies at this stage of history are what I would posit the gravest concern or gravest threat to Canada in this hybrid threat, hybrid conflict, hybrid warfare state that we find ourselves in with two major competitors, Russia and China in particular. Whether we call them competitors, adversaries, enemies, it doesn't really matter. In the 21st century, this highly complex, globally connected world, when we look at it from a first world perspective, from a Canadian perspective, we are net beneficiaries of global connectedness, globalization, and what we've seen happen over the last 50 to 60 years. However, as John alluded to with the rule of law as an example, our adversaries, our competitors, who don't necessarily play by those same rules, are using some of those rules against us. And this is where I would say, in some cases, Canada's like that proverbial frog sitting in that boiling pot of water. And so I believe the hybrid threats, that hybrid conflict, is the gravest threat to our national security and our national way of life today. And I don't say that lightly, because we've all lived through a number of strategic shocks over the last 30, 40 years in particular. But what is going on in the hybrid conflict space is largely under the radar for Canadians. It is below the NATO thresholds for collective defense, and it is being very successfully campaigned and managed by the Russians and Chinese, who are our global competitors. So I just offer that up, that I believe in Canada, we are not necessarily negligent, but we're not really paying attention to what's going on around us. So a couple of things that if you go back to John's list of 30, that I would like to just to highlight from a Canadian perspective. So if we appreciate that those threats are out there, and let's just paint a couple of specific pictures and then bring them forward into the 21st century, even though some of these are 20th century problems that we had. So if we think back to the 1998 ice storm, for example, or the 2003 power outage across the eastern United States and eastern Canada, those two electric events, power transmission events, electrical grid events, killed a couple of hundred Canadians and hurt thousands of Canadians, one happening in the wintertime, one happening in the summertime. If we think about this from an adversary perspective, though, that our electrical grid, our power generation system, that aging infrastructure is absolutely under assault every given day by our competitors. If we see what's going on with elections, and whether that be south of the border in the US, whether that be in Europe, or whether that be with some upcoming elections in Canada, we know that our competitors, Russia and China, are definitely messing with elections, which comes back to my comment about Canadians largely being either uninformed or in some cases misinformed. So I want to jump down to media. The media in Canada is not necessarily as fair or balanced on national security issues as I would posit that they should be. And some of that could very well be from interference from outside actors and outside agencies. So what that means, though, is that we see in some cases misinformation, black information operations. At the end of the day, it's misinformation into the Canadian electorate about what's going on and what's not going on. Just look at what's going on with COVID and the campaign and the challenge that the governments at all levels are having, getting a coherent message out around a pandemic, which is relatively plain as day. If that can get massaged and tweaked again by an adversary through, again, messing with aging critical infrastructure or other misinformation, it shows you how they start to fracture some of the divisions that live within Canadian society. I'd shift gears to China and specifically the two Michaels. Hostage diplomacy could also be another way of talking about the rule of law or not applying to international norms. China and the two Michaels and the hostage diplomacy is certainly a hybrid way of applying pressure to Canadians, Canadian businesses, and obviously our elected officials. And then lastly, if we look at what's going on from the cyberspace, those vectors and pathways, whether it be through our financial system at risk, whether it be through our national critical infrastructure, all again, which is aging, electrical grids, transportation, communications, emergency management systems, and water. And we've heard the stories of what happened in, I believe it was Florida recently, about water and things going on with the systems that regulate and manage water for our populations. So the last point before I wanted to maybe open this up for folks to certainly, Dan, have a bit of a Q&A, is I do believe that the hybrid conflict, hybrid warfare, hybrid threats are absolutely happening every day. We've got misinformed or uninformed Canadians that are not taking it seriously enough. And in the 21st century, which is a highly complex, highly integrated system of systems, for Western liberal democracies, it's an exceptionally challenging time. When you look at it from a Canadian perspective, where we have a history of underinvesting in our national security, our national intelligence, our national policing and national defense capabilities, we are arguably at the worst time in our history for being prepared to defend ourselves against any pathway, vector, or threat that they may be coming through. So my final comment is, at this point in time, I do not believe that I do not see dragons everywhere, but I absolutely believe there are grave threats to our way of life. I believe to a certain aspect, we are an unserious country during exceptionally serious times. So Dan, I'll hand it back over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, John. I'd like to start off. I've got a question for each of you. Let me start with you, Steve, if I may. Many of the threats that John outlined are certainly not within the traditional realm of national security agencies per se, i.e. the Canadian Armed Forces, CSIS, etc. Many of these touch on the political sphere, they touch on diplomacy, the media, etc. How would you envision Canada being able to respond to that range of threats in some kind of coherent fashion, given that they touch on such a wide range of areas that really implicate almost every kind of government response that would be possible? How would you envision that we organize ourselves to be effective in that space?
Well, it's a great question, Dan. I think this is one of the conundrums in Canada. We have these supposed silos of excellence, and make no mistake about it, within certain communities inside Canada, we are world class and world beaters. They're at the tactical level in almost all of our national security silos. We are exceptional. Like, we are very, very good at that. Where we start to get challenges as we come further up that, because there is no national integrator. The best thing you can look at from a national integrator perspective is the Government Operations Center. And I can tell you that is not a very good integrator. Most of it is unclassified, or certainly not operating at the right classification level. And a lot of it is not joined up. So when you start looking at true national security threats and how the RCMP, CSIS, and D&D try to work at the grand strategic level, it is ad hoc, and it's ad hoc by design, which goes back to my conversation about we are not serious about some of these threats. And so therefore, as you've rightly pointed out, some of these vectors and pathways that don't necessarily follow or flow through a normal national security channel get missed. They get completely missed because nobody is integrating and bringing together that one threat picture. That has been my experience dealing at the national level in Canada.
Okay, thanks, Steve. So John, question I've got for you, and it's related to some other questions that are starting to pop up. You spoke a lot about Russia, and obviously NATO now has cottoned on to the spectrum of potential threats. Has Russia, in effect, kind of tipped their hand? In other words, they were very successful, clearly, in the Ukraine, caught NATO, basically off guard and not ready. Given the attention that's been paid to hybrid threats, particularly emanating from Russia in the last few years, do you think that really Russia could continue? Could they be as successful, shall we say, in another country bordering their state?
They're kind of running out of countries that are not NATO members. And if what happened in Ukraine happened in a NATO member state, it would be a very different beast, I think. And I think that's not lost on the Russians. That's why they did things in Ukraine that they knew they could not get away with inside of a NATO member state, because it would come very, very close to war. However, the techniques, the Russians will modulate what they do based upon what country they're dealing with and what they would like to get them to do. There's no threat whatsoever of Russian regular army forces in Spain. But that doesn't mean that Russia isn't interested in Spanish activities. So like Trotsky said, war, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Well, you may not be interested in hybrid threats, but hybrid threats are interested in you.
Okay, thank you. I think that Christopher Ayotte has a question.
So my question is, I guess, can be fielded by both, because it is really about allies. And Steve outlined the Canadian strategic approach, or potentially lack thereof, when it comes to hybrid threats. And I was wondering, how does our approach then influence either the way allies see us or the way that we are integrated in with certain aspects of various alliances, Five Eyes, NATO, etc. Because clearly, if this is a challenge for us, then our role and our value added to various alliances must be called into question.
Steve, you want to take that?
Yeah, I'm happy to take a first stab at it. So again, as I mentioned off the top, generally, thanks for joining us. My lens on this, as we look at the time when we were when we were moving through Eastern Europe, is that the Eastern Europeans look to Canada to lead where we can, understanding that we do have limited capabilities and limited capacities. So when you see what Canada is doing in Latvia on the ground and in Ukraine on the ground, although it's a small tactical footprint, it has a large strategic bang for the buck from that perspective. But that goes back to my comment about tactical excellence is great, but at that national strategic level, we're probably not doing enough, in my opinion. So I don't know how our allies view that, to be honest, because when on the circuits that I was moving, Canada was seen as a bit of a bit player, right? The US is the big boy at the party that brings all the capabilities, and the Canadian was always, okay, we really appreciate you being here. Really appreciate you being here. But what's behind the 200 guys that are on the ground?
What I would say is that first off, NATO as an alliance, their policy is the primary responsibility for countering hybrid threats is the member state. It's not really an alliance function; it's a member state function. And so, what we have done, Steve and I and some others, going from country to country to talk about getting inter-ministry conversations going and potentially setting up structures to facilitate that conversation. What Mark Galeotti, who's a Brit, one of my favorite authors about this subject, he says, make cops talk to spooks, which means, if you're looking at a bad guy, the intel agency wants to keep the guy in play so you can get some more intel out of him. The cop says, no, as soon as I get enough evidence, I want to arrest him and put him in jail and try him and put him in jail. And so someone has to make the decision, which way are you going to go? Are you going to keep the guy in play or are you going to arrest him? And that's got to be inter-ministry. But that's just a small example, but making sure that other ministries are aware of what the foreign ministry or the intel agencies are, you got to have some structure to cross-level information, because otherwise, like Steve said, everyone's looking in their silos and they're really good in their silos, but no one's looking across silos.
Okay, thank you. One of our attendees is interested in looking at this from the Canadian perspective in terms of both sort of an anti-hybrid threat capability. In other words, have we, given the threat spectrum, have we developed some specific capabilities? Obviously, this is an unclass discussion, but at the same time, given what we now know and what we've learned, I mean, do we have the capability of utilizing hybrid techniques against our opposition? And is that something that's beyond our legal and ethical moral ken, or is it part and parcel of what we now consider to be our posture and our capacity allows us to do it? That could be either one of you gentlemen.
Yeah, maybe I'll take a run at it first, John. So as I understand the question and you're framing it up, Dan, what I think is important in this conversation, that hybrid warfare is not new. It's asymmetrical. It's the weak against the powerful, trying to find those gaps and seams where they can gain influence and tip the scales in their favor. So hybrid warfare is not new. It's a sexy new term, I get it. But there's nothing new about what's going on, except for some cases the techniques or capabilities or technology, specifically dual purpose technology that was created for some civilian use, but is actually being used now from a more nefarious perspective. So I don't think from a Canadian perspective, again, in an unclassified form, that we necessarily need to have any specific anti-hybrid warfare capabilities. What we need to have is joined up national defense, national security, fusion, and a national intelligence picture so that our limited resources could be vectored onto the right challenge. Not only that, if we look at it from the financial industry and the banking industry, those systems are under assault daily. How is that picture getting brought into a national threat picture? That's a question we should be asking ourselves. And I don't believe although those conversations are underway, I don't believe we're mature enough yet to have a true national threat picture, as John had talked about when we had been dealing with some of our allies in Eastern Europe in particular, who've developed some of these capabilities. Does that answer your point, Dan?
Yes, it does. Thank you. John, do you want to make any comments about that?
I would say this: the Russians, they don't use the word hybrid warfare other than to describe what the West is doing to them. Anytime there's an anti-government protest in Moscow, the Navalny protests, a few months ago, and the anti-Lukashenko ones in August, the Russians believe that is the CIA or whoever putting all these protesters up to employ. They would call that hybrid warfare. It's foreign intelligence services that are making these protesters protest. They're not doing it because they're angry at their government policy.
That's a good point. And someone asked a question. Again, this may apply as well to the U.S., but is there a possibility that an adversary is trying to exploit current issues in terms of our Indigenous reconciliation environment? This is obviously a very divisive issue in Canada. Do you think there's a potential that this could be an active measure at this point in time?
I'll take a first stab at that. I would use, whether it be that example or any of these highly emotive social challenges that underpin the Canadian social fabric, that fabric is not that strong and can be torn away at and pulled apart. And so whether it be Indigenous issues, whether it be the other issues that we're having in society, from the Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movements, any of those issues that rightfully need to be sorted out in the 21st century, but can also be hijacked by folks, adversaries, global competitors, to achieve their ends. And sometimes we lose sight of that because we live in a free and prosperous first world nation. And there's other people that are going to exploit our openness against us.
I think Eric Morris has got a question.
Question for Steve. And I had two questions. Dan just asked the big one, which relieves me of having to. John, I was interested in your comment on Galeotti. I read every word he writes. But question for Steve. Getting down to the very micro level, interference in electoral processes. Where do you see the weak point in Canada? Because I worked as a returning officer for about 3 elections, and I was quite surprised at the robustness of the electoral machinery at the working level. So I would see it as fooling with the voting lists, or just jumping right up to the top and manipulating the politics.
Yeah, so I am not an electoral expert at all, Eric. Clearly, you're well above me in this space. But what I would offer as maybe a thought, if we look at what was going on in the latest presidential elections in the U.S., irrespective of the facts, one way or the other, from a black IO or an information operation perspective, misinformation and Canadians' susceptibility to be misinformed, I think, is the greatest threat to our electoral system. I actually think the system itself is relatively secure, but we can't control what Johnny and Jane Canuck do inside the box when they're pulling the levers.
Well, luckily we don't have levers.
It's a metaphor, I think.
No, in the States, it's real. That's the problem.
Let me combine a couple of questions, and I think they are, in a sense, relevant to both the U.S. and Canada, having to do with the most significant hybrid threats to Canada and the US, in terms of some kind of ranking, what would the top three be? But perhaps they're easy to identify. But having said that, is there some way that we can educate Canadians on hybrid threats before some kind of national security crisis emerges? Or are we still stuck in the frame of mind that Canadians and perhaps the general US population sees themselves as being somewhat immune from these sorts of things? Don, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, sure. For me, I would say, and I'm not a Canadian, although I'd very much like to be. The three that I would recommend Canada watch out for the most are intelligence activities, cyber, and black info ops, because those three have been used against the U.S., I think, quite effectively. And I'm sure that the FAN has got a cell that they do North American ops, what they call it, but I'm sure that part of that's divvied up for Canada and part for the U.S. because they realize that there's different systems. So that would be the three I'd recommend. And how do you shock people out of it? I think 2016 in the U.S. certainly shocked the Democratic half of the country out of their lethargy about Russia when they watched their candidate lose and like, how the heck did that happen? And what have we got to do to make sure that doesn't happen again? But at the same time, President Obama said we don't have one electoral system in the United States. We have like 50 electoral systems. Every state's different. My state's, I think, pretty secure, but there are some states that have no paper ballot. There's no record. Once you vote electronically, and it's gone. There's no way to recount that, which is weird to me, but whatever. Steve?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a challenging question because I come back to from the Canadian naivete on international relations and our role in the world, and we are an unserious nation in that space. So, and I don't mean to paint everybody with a broad brush, but I will make this general comment. When we as a nation are led by politicians who for the most part now are professional politicians, they did not really come from some other walk of life per se. They are professional politicians and they are focused on that election cycle alone. If the Canadian population cannot rally around these things to put the right people in power, then we are really a nation of lions led by lambs. And we're sitting there kind of prostate while all these threats and vectors are actually metastasizing around us. So I do believe that as a national psyche, that we do believe those three great oceans and the superpower to the south keep all that flammable material away. But the reality in the 21st century is it's no longer applicable. And I go back to the 1998 or even 2003 power outages. If our electrical grid goes down again at the wrong time, and all the other interconnected systems that are tied to that start to be dragged down, because our national critical infrastructure is such in an aging state, we could be as a nation in a world of hurt. And because we're so urbanized right now, there will be that strategic shock to the Canadians where people will unnecessarily die because we were not prepared. And I would use the pandemic again and our mishandling of the pandemic at every level of government as a clue or as a canary in the mine shaft that we are not prepared for the seriousness of the 21st century. Dan, I hope that answers your question, Dan.
Yeah, it does. And if I could just kind of take that a step further, I mean, one of our attendees has made an observation, I think it's a good one, that within some elements of government and I think also the private sector, there are investments being made in, for example, the cyber domain, because it's been identified as being so centrally critical to so many systems, particularly critical infrastructure itself. And yet we have a system, I think in Canada and I think arguably in the US, where the civil component of cyber defenses and the military component of cyber defenses are kept quite separate. And I think that presents perhaps an opportunity for the bad guys to kind of walk up the middle between those two things. Is this is this primarily, do you think, because of sort of the legal structures and for example, privacy issues and copyright and trademark, where private sector industry is concerned about people getting access to their information, and so they just don't want other players to be involved. So I think there's an opportunity there to maybe create a more holistic response to the cyber threat.
Yeah, I'll make again a general comment now, putting my business hat on, having consulted with one of Canada's national banks and some other corporations in Canada. The challenge we have on the private industry side is it's driven by shareholders and dividends. And so nobody wants to report when things are going bad because it affects the stock price. So one of the weaknesses in our capitalistic system is that share price is more important than about reporting certain things to help us paint out that constellation that is happening at the national level. So they could be picking on one specific company this week, getting it to the tipping point, but not pushing all the way over. And then next week going to another sector, another industry, and pushing there, so that they are constantly doing recce by fire, if you will, on our cyber grid or our grid overall. In my opinion, Dan.
Do you think that when Ronaldo pushed those 2 Coca-Cola bottles away from himself and reached for a bottle of water, and the share price of Coca-Cola fell by $400 billion overnight? No, that couldn't have been the Russians doing that. I don't think so. That's too smart.
Maybe Chinese.
I don't see any other questions either in the Q&A. Sylvia, I don't know if you see any other raised hands. I hope that the folks who ask questions are happy with the answers you provided. I know I certainly am. So I'll give anybody a last chance here to ask any other questions. Otherwise, we're going to start to close our session for this evening up. Okay. Steve and John, can I ask you if you have any last thoughts that you'd like to share with our audience? We'd be happy to hear them.
I'll go first and then hand back over to John. And I do wish to recount that, like, I don't see dragons everywhere, but I absolutely see gaps and vulnerabilities in the Canadian national security architecture. And I do think if we can get ahead of this, we can stay ahead of it. But if we don't get ahead of it and we continue the underinvestment, I truly believe this is one of the gravest threats to our prosperity, as that fabric that is Canada could get slowly torn apart and fissures and other problems created because of the hybrid threat that our global competitors are absolutely doing to us every day.
Steve, John?
Yeah, all I would say is what is dangerous about hybrid threats is that the way that it comes at the target country from so many different vectors. It's a switch. It's a gathered up technique of coming at a target country. The only way to respond is to have a joined up response. Make cops talk to spooks, make soldiers talk to diplomats, make public relations people in the government talk to media types in the government or in private sector. And it's got to be a coordinated response to be effective. That's the hard part about a hybrid. And in a Western liberal democracy, that is hard.
Yeah, excellent points, both. Great stuff. So on behalf of our membership, the RCMI, folks who are here tonight and guests, thank you very much, both of you, for taking the time to speak with us. As you know, this has been recorded, and we find going forward that very many more members and people are literally around Canada and around the United States and other places watch these presentations in great numbers. So your words will be echoed again and again in other places at other times. So that's great stuff. So on behalf of the RCMI Defense and Security Studies Program, and I know our president, Lieutenant Commander Dr. Mike Hoare, has been watching in as well. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us tonight. We look forward to seeing you again in the future, and Yes, I think we're getting closer to being back into the RCMI live very soon. And if so, I look forward to seeing you in the long bar and having a drink with you. So John and Steve, again, our thanks. Appreciate it. Sylvia, as always, an outstanding job making sure we're all on track. And Eric, your support is always welcome at the communications and marketing front. So thanks again. Good night, everybody. Stay safe. We're getting close, and we'll see you at the RCMI. Take care and good night.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.